Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 122 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Meghan Riordan Jarvis for this episode. And Meghan is the host of the Grief is My Side Hustle podcast, and she's also a trauma therapist. And one of the really cool things is that she and I got to talk back to back. First, she interviewed me for her show, and then 2 days later, we turned it around and I interviewed her for this show, which is what you'll be hearing in today's episode. And we actually are releasing our episodes back to back as well. So if you're listening to this in August 2022 as it comes out, look on the Grief is My Side Hustle podcast for, it should be August 9th. Her interview of me on her podcast comes out. So I would encourage you listen to both of those episodes in tandem. We had such a great discussion. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but because Meghan's a trauma therapist, I think I might have even said 2 or 3 times in a discussion that she was kind of blowing my mind with some of the things that she was saying about trauma and the difference between trauma and being traumatized and why some things are traumatizing for some people that aren't for other people. It's a really important discussion, and she specializes in this intersection of grief and trauma. And she has a lot to share with us of wisdom and knowledge on this topic. So please, I would love to know what you think after you listen to our discussion and what you find the most helpful. Before we jump into my discussion with Meghan, I want to let you guys know some news from here. I did share last week that Future Widow, which is my book, is available in quite a few library systems, actually, across the U.S. and a couple outside the U.S. as well. So today I wanted to shout out the Minuteman Library Network, which is outside of Boston, and they have, I believe it's 3 copies of my book on their shelves in their system. They have a few different branches, and I did a community talk for them last November about grief allies, which was really terrific. We talked about ways to be a good ally or supporter of grieving people in your life, and so they have my book on their shelves. And so if you're in the Boston area and if you're a member of the Minuteman Library Network, I would encourage you to go and look for it there. And if you are not in that area, a reminder that you can request the print book or the ebook from your local public library. And it is also available in a large print edition as well. So if your local public library does not have it, you might ask them if they would be willing to order it in. Okay, that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Meghan Riordan Jarvis. Meghan is a psychotherapist specializing in trauma and grief and loss, and she works in private practice in Washington, D.C. She's the host of the Grief is My Side Hustle podcast and also has a popular blog by the same name. Meghan is joining us today from Washington, D.C. Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is good to see you again. 2 days this week. I was almost not 2 days in a row. I guess it was 2 days ago we talked, but
right. That's right.
For listeners, I'll say that 2 days ago, Meghan interviewed me on her show, Grief is My Side Hustle. And today we're turning the microphone around and I get to interview you on my show. So this is so cool.
So fun. I've never done this before. It's a first for me.
Well, and even better, we have now established that these episodes are actually going to drop at the same time on August 9th and 10th. So I will encourage listeners, if you're listening to this one, now go and listen to the one on Meghan's show. And if you've just listened to the one on Meghan's show, thank you very much. And now thank you for listening to this one as well.
Amazing. They'll have everything they need to know about us.
Uh-oh.
2-hour segment.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's see. So I think what I'm hoping to talk with you today is about trauma and grief.
Yeah.
And maybe specifically one aspect of it. I mean, so you have grief, but sometimes people need more support, maybe. Absolutely. Whatever more means, whatever support means. And I think there's a nuance, like, is there or isn't there trauma involved with somebody's grief? And how do you even know? Or is that a thing? Or what does that mean? Or what are your options? And I'm sure it's a big, sticky ball of whatever to try to unpack.
Yeah.
So, but since you're a specialist in trauma and grief and loss, and you have personal experience as well.
I do.
This is going to be the perfect topic to tee up for us today. So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I love the question because it gives the opportunity to sort of like walk down the path of where our culture around grief and loss hasn't given us enough information. So the answer to your question actually exists. And it's lovely to be asked, because then what we get to do is sort of say, let me hand you this piece. And then now you know it. And the next time you hear the confusion out there, you can just offer one piece of this. So let me just, if you don't mind, let me open it up a little bit and say that part of the confusion is around the word trauma. So we don't have like the perfect working definition of trauma, and Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, does a good job of sort of like just giving us a global explanation. And what I'll say is to our listeners, trauma is what you think it is, something bad happening. Mm-hmm. But trauma is the event, the experience. Now, that can be, we used to call it big T and little t trauma, but that sort of acts as though one is more important than the other. So instead, we're talking about words like developmental trauma, which means it happened over time at significant points in your life, something like childhood neglect or abuse, or single event trauma, like being in a hurricane or a car accident or, a mugging. And go ahead. You look like
this is interesting. Okay, so developmental trauma and single event trauma.
Yeah.
Because I would think, assuming coming into this blind, like trauma feels like a big event. Like I was in a war and I got, bombs and now I'm traumatized. Or like a traumatic event in civilian life, maybe, being raped or assaulted. You could pinpoint that as a single event.
Yes.
So feels big.
You used the most important word, which is traumatized. So there's a traumatic event, which is basically you define that. You define whether it's a traumatic event to you, that you being left in the car and your mother running into the bank and getting stuck in the bank for an hour could be a traumatic event for you. And for someone else, that could be an awesome time for childhood play, pretending to drive the car uninterrupted. So the challenge around trauma is it's up to the person to define the event. Was this bad for you or not? And which is why, like, I have 5 brothers and sisters. We were all in a lot of events together. I don't know that we would all define them each as traumatic, but the thing that is the most important is that traumatized means it overwhelmed your central nervous system. I know, right? You had a biophysical response that blew you outside. And this phrase comes from, a neurologist, outside your window of tolerance, meaning there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can handle in life. When we're traumatized, we're blown out of what we can handle. And we have these defenses: fight, flight, freeze. Some people put fawn in there, but fight, flight, and freeze are the ones that are wired inside our brain. So when something is more than I can handle, I will instinctively run, fight. And if those don't work, so they're actually progressive, which also most people don't know. We do fight, we do flight, and then we do freeze. And freeze is just sort of the curl up in a ball and try to get through it. Freeze is where most trauma happens.
That's interesting.
It is, right? So, and most people don't know these things. And I get challenged a lot where people say, well, I didn't fight and I didn't flee. And I understand that. What I would say is your system learns. So particularly for people who had childhood trauma, let's say your dad was an alcoholic and he used to come home and he would rage. You learned very quickly not to fight him because it wasn't useful. You learned very quickly not to flee because that made him more angry. So you're sort of conditioned towards But as a series of instinctive responses, they are actually progressive. And we have data on that from psychologists. So traumatization is about your central nervous system being overwhelmed. And we have Mary Frances O'Connor, who wrote The Grieving Brain, use the fMRIs. fMRIs are these scans of our brain where they sort of map it in color. And Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot about fMRIs. But basically, it shows you what's going on inside the brain, how much activation there is. And so Bessel van der Kolk in his book has this really brilliant example, which is pretty amazing, of two people that worked for him. They were in a car accident. And he was able to, coming to the office, and so he was able to shortly thereafter take images of their brain. Because the difficulty with trauma is we don't have people hooked up to fMRIs generally when they're being traumatized. And so generally what we have to do is ask them to call up a memory of the traumatic event and map it from there. And it's never going to show us, exactly what's going on. But what's interesting is traumatized brains freeze. They shut down, they look dark. And part of what's happening there is really instinctive, amazing physiological responses where it's trying to keep you from coding memories of this awful thing that's happening to you.
Huh.
So rape victims will talk about totally dissociating from their body and maybe even being on the ceiling and looking down. So they have a really floaty sensation of what's happening. And that has to do, the amygdala is this tiny little thing in the back, the very back of the brain at the base of the neck. And it's part of the limbic system, and it's responsible for activating the fight and flight and freeze responses. So it's called like the smoke alarm. That's what Bessel van der Kolk talks, and it inflates. So a bear comes up to you in the woods. Your amygdala inflates. You're going to fight, flight, freeze in succession. And what happens is the electricity in that, it's almost like a dam. The amygdala enlarges and it stops the electrical currents from going all the way up to our prefrontal cortex is behind our forehead. And that's where we do our critical thinking. And so when you talk to people who've had a traumatic loss, particularly, they'll tell you they had all these crazy thoughts. And then they have shame about those thoughts. Like when my grandfather died, I was little, but the very first thing that I thought was, who's going to drive me to high school? Like if you guys are at a funeral. And, there can be a lot of shame around that. Like, what kind of a person would think that? Except biology is actually at play, and the electrical currents that are going into your brain are, honestly, they're doing a bad job in order to protect you. They're trying to keep you from coding difficult memories. They're trying to keep you from thinking too much about what to do and to just impulsively respond. And what's really important, particularly for grievers, is that amygdala response and that trauma in the body can last a really long time. So when we're talking about, there's this difficult diagnosis that's recently been added to the DSM-5 TR and to other coding books where we look to for diagnosis and insurance. People get really riled up, particularly about this new diagnosis, which is about, the way in which complex grief happens. And the reason people are fired up about it is it has a time period in there, right? And grievers don't ever want to be told how long or what is supposed to happen with their grief, because it's ours and it's going to be what it is. However, the diagnostic is there to help people understand that if your biophysical responses, you have brain fog, you can't sleep, you can't eat, you don't have good memories, you can't follow multi-step, there's lots of people that are like, what did you say to do next? All of that is totally normal. That you have ruminations, that there's some images, that all of it is totally normal, and the body is wired to heal. So in grief that we call, whatever word you want to use, because different code books, but not complicated, not compound grief, however you want to describe it. grief that is resolving, those symptoms tend to go away on their own over time. Never as fast as we want them to. But George Bonanno, who's a researcher, has given us sort of these statistics, and it's everywhere from, I think the Center for Compound Grief at in Columbia says it's 12%. I think George Bonanno says it's something like 6%. But anyway, it's not a huge number of people that report that they need tons of intervention. But I needed tons of intervention. And my grief, I'm an expert in this. I've been doing it for a bunch of years. When my mom died suddenly, I knew that the ruminations that I started out having sort of like immediately after she died, I had these thoughts of like, oh my God, it's my fault she died. And then I went to be and pray over her body in the way that I knew she would want to have happen. And then I had images of her dead body every time I wasn't distracted. And it wasn't lessening. It was getting worse and worse and worse. And so even though I have all these descriptions and ways to say to people, okay, well, the book says this and you got to do that, it's really kind of simple in that if you feel like your symptoms, your physical symptoms, if your body feels like it's moving further away from the body that you know and that is reliable and can get rest and can nourish itself, and it's being more dysregulated, go get help. That's the threshold that I use.
Okay.
It doesn't matter if it's been a year. It doesn't matter if it's been 6 weeks.
Right. Okay. So I think there's about 15 different things you've talked about that I want to follow up on.
Good. I'll be quiet now.
Or maybe 25. I don't know. Like, I'm thinking about which path do we go down next year? Because, well, let's start with the most simple, because you used a few terms there.
Yeah.
You used the word complicated grief, compound grief. I wonder what those mean. And is that the same or not the same as traumatic grief? You didn't use the word prolonged grief, but that's what you were talking about with the new wording that you might see in the DSM manual. Can you just kind of tell us these definitions? Like, are they the same or not?
You know what? It's almost like I want to avoid telling you the definitions because I'll tell you why, because I don't think they are diagnostically useful. So I don't, complex grief basically means grief that isn't resolving. Compound grief means you've had a bunch of things to grieve and it's too much for your system. But every one of those phrases to me, and traumatic grief means that your body is having a traumatic response. Grief is a trauma. It's not the only trauma that's out there. And again, trauma is for you to decide if it's terrible for you. But the reason that I shy away from like doing really concrete definitions is that, like, for me, the reason why my mother's death was so difficult was because I had unresolved childhood trauma around grief and loss. And so, like, it doesn't really fit comfortably in any of these diagnostics. And if we're going to say the definitions are there to help us understand better, it's almost like I like it to be broader. And I like it to be based on what's happening inside your system. Because what I see up on grief and loss boards are like, I don't have this, but I do have that. When should I go see a therapist? Do I need to go see a therapist? I mean, when you're on a grief and loss board, you can really see the sort of stigma is still out there. And with my clients, like if we have my clients in the room right now, they would chuckle a little bit because I am a big believer of bringing like 2 picnic baskets in case you're extra hungry. I want people to feel like they have all the resources in the world. So if you're not sure, go see someone who specializes in grief and loss, who says, you don't have to come to therapy. This is going to be okay, but I'm here to support you. I have things that I can help offer you.
Right.
I do think that there is a small percentage, and I was in that category, where if left unsupported, those things were going to, the image I always use with my clients is like a windshield that has ice across it, like crystallize and become the truth. I mean, as the images, if I hadn't gone and gotten treatment, I was never going to be able to get off my porch. Because just trying to be out in the world inside my body and mind was really pretty terrible. So, I mean, I can give you the definitions of all of those things. I don't know that to listeners, I don't know. The answer is, if you feel like, and this is the question I always ask people, like, what do you think? Do you think that this is resolving on its own in that way that we would all hope for a sister or a mother or a cousin? Or do you think you're struggling? Do you think you need intervention? And that question usually people can answer. They usually have a sense for themselves that like things are not going well.
Right. That makes sense. Let's talk for a minute about your own experience, and I want to come back to some of the things that we talked about. So I made a note here.
Good.
I should be taking a lot more notes. So then let's just talk about, so for listeners, and kind of a little bit about your experience with grief with your parents, and just to say you were not a child or a teenager.
No, this was 3 years ago. My mom died, and 5 years ago, my dad.
Right. And I think it's one of the things that's interesting is that your parents died within a couple of years of each other, and one of them was traumatic for you and one of them wasn't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about each of those losses and kind of the differences?
Yeah. Well, let me just say that when I referenced the childhood loss, so there was a death in my social circle, in my family, in my small town, of a teenager who was beloved to us and everyone, and in fact is my very best friend since I was age 11, who I speak to every single day on the phone, her oldest cousin. And he drowned while we were on the beach, but we didn't know that had happened. And my brother found him in the water, and my mother was there when they pulled his body out. So my mom experienced her own PTSD from that. And that was in 1983. And in 1983, the belief was, don't talk to kids about bad things, just keep moving forward. And so I didn't understand until I was like 23 when I got to therapy and went in. I was like, I don't know why this breakup I'm going through is like destroying my sense of safety in the world. And the therapist was like, well, we might talk about things that have gone on in your family life. And I was like, no, they're not the problem. This is the breakup is the problem. And really what came to sort of unfold for me was this whole picture of trying to navigate how awful those feelings were as an 8-year-old. And the meaning that I had made from that, which is really what is at the root of trauma, is the bad thing happens, and then the meaning that you make is less good than where you came from. And that was certainly true. Like, I was terrified that my brother was going to die when he turned 16. I was pretty convinced that adults were actually not in charge of keeping kids safe, that the world was not a very good place. So a lot of dysfunctional thinking and believing and being came from there. So I went to therapy. I loved therapy. It was amazing. My therapist was amazing. She signed me on. And I really felt like I got my ducks in a row. I'm going out into the world. I'm going to be great. My dad was diagnosed with small cell cancer, which is a death sentence. And he died a year later. So that's the trajectory. You usually have about a year of life, whether you do interventions like chemotherapy or not. He was 78 when he was diagnosed. He was 80 when he died. And he knew he was dying. And I knew he was dying. I can't speak for the rest of my family, because I think there were differing levels of denial of what was going on, but he and I were not confused. And my dad and I did not have the closest relationship. So I was very grateful to have a year where I could sort of drop any long-term disappointments I had about, he wasn't the dad I wanted. Maybe I wasn't the daughter he wanted. But I loved him really deeply. And I was there when he died, and I was there a lot. I spent more time with him in the year that he was dying than I had in any other year of my adult life. And we talked a lot about his death. We talked about what he wanted. And, he asked me to call 33 people after he died and tell them personally, which maybe wasn't the best plan for either of us. Like, that was in and of itself a little traumatic. So it just wasn't traumatizing in that very core definition. Like, it didn't blow me outside of my window of tolerance. I knew what was happening. I knew the time frame around what was happening, and I participated in it. It was tremendously sad. It's still sad, but it wasn't more than my body and my mind could handle. And it's based on the relationship. My dad, I have an older brother who I'm really close to, who was very dad-like to me in my life. Like when I needed support and like, how do I get a mortgage? He answered a lot of those questions for me. So my dad was like an adjunct, I didn't rely on him for money. I didn't really rely on him for advice. We spent time together. I liked him. I loved him, but I could go months without talking to him. So his absence from my life, again, it was manageable. When my mom and I took a little trip, she had been married to my dad for 50 years. It was a really, really difficult adjustment. I really can't imagine what that must be like. She married my dad when she was 19. And my husband was taking our kids to England, and my mom said, well, if they're going to England, why don't you and I go do something? And I was like, oh my God, amazing. So we went to this small town in Maine, and she wasn't well. She had what she thought was a really bad stomach bug. It had gone around in her church, and she wasn't well. And, there were some weird things that went on where I think both of us might have known that she was really not well, but not consciously. And I left her in Maine. Well, she went back to her house in Cape Cod. I came back up a few days later, and she was noticeably not doing well. I took her to the hospital. The hospital said she should just follow up. It's just a stomach bug. And she died 5 days later in her sleep.
Wow.
And I was on vacation there with my kids, and the experience of the same way that I think, trauma resides in the body. I was away from my mom's house. I had driven to go pick up my best friend, as I mentioned a minute ago, her son, which is about an hour and 15 minutes away from my mom's house in Boston. And I had this sensation of like water breaking in my body. And I looked down expecting to see water. And then I had this thought, and this doesn't usually happen to me. And the thought was, she's dead. And I called my husband, who was back at the house where my mom was, and said, have you seen my mom? I think she died. And she died.
Wow.
And so then I got the kids back in the car and had to manage this moment. And this is the part that's about childhood trauma for me. So as a child, I did that thing that children of trauma sometimes do, where they try to help the parents in the hard thing that's happening. And so I understand now that, who knows if this would have prevented my trauma, but I did have this moment where I was like, wow, I have a van full of children, and I can either show up for them like a grown-up and get them where they need to go, or I can lose my mind in this like ancient broken down Dairy Queen parking lot that I had pulled into when my husband was, telling me the news. And I picked the kids. And so instead of, getting support, which really, when we're looking at children, and you and I talked about this on my podcast, there's a lot of stuff that children can go through that seems impossibly hard as long as they have enough support. And I went too long without getting support. I didn't get to be the daughter who was grieving my mom. I was the high functioning adult who was, taking care of the funeral and taking care of this. And I knew what my mother would have wanted in the moment when she died. I knew she would have wanted someone to pray over her body. That woman said the rosary multiple times a day. So I felt a real deep urgency to get to her and do that. First of all, I don't know the rosary. And I'm not religious. And so I felt this profound sense of failure, having gotten to her body, having to see her dead body, and failing her. That's what it felt like. And the images of her dead body were then in my brain at a time when I was really needing support and feeling like a failure. And so they just tattooed in there. And then they, like a flip book, were just relentless. So I didn't have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It didn't develop, as it generally doesn't, until you're sort of away from the stressful event. So the day after my mother's funeral, I had low muscle tone. I couldn't pick my own body up. Every time people stopped talking, I saw pictures of her death in my head, and I could hear in my head, "It's your fault. it's your fault. And I just, I'm grateful that I'm a trauma therapist because I treat people with this. I knew what it was. So it didn't go on for very long before. I mean, well, I did then throw my back out and, I tried to treat it with outpatient support first, and knowing that I probably needed more than that, ultimately ended up checking myself into the same treatment facility that I send my clients in Tennessee, and got round the clock help. EMDR, sensory motor psychotherapy, IFS, every possible thing.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you right there because there's a whole bunch of acronyms and names of treatments that I don't know. I mean, I've heard of EMDR, although I haven't had a topic on that on the show yet. I probably should cover that one. But I didn't know that. Okay, so you mentioned a treatment facility in Tennessee. So there's a place. It's specifically for treating people with trauma?
It is. So most inpatient facilities are really primarily geared towards addiction. And there are a few in the country that are geared towards trauma. So someone had something terrible happen to them. It blew them out of their window of tolerance, and their body is so dysregulated. It needs treatments like EMDR, and EMDR is a bilateral brain stimulation that uses your eyes. You basically look to the left and look to the right while you are thinking about the bad thing that happened to you. And it helps to, it's crazy. It's like voodoo, but it helps. And for some patients, it helps immediately. You need one session and that's it. It takes the image and it takes it from the hard sort of permanent marker image, and it makes it sort of watercolor, and it becomes less invasive. So, for other people, it can be 20 sessions, it can be 50 sessions, but it's really impactful. And sensory motor psychotherapy asks you to go back to that state of freeze. So when I did a sensory motor, it was also in IFS, which is internal family systems, which is using your imagination. You're imagining a different result, and sensory motor psychotherapy is you're embodying a different result. So you get up, if there's a car accident, you couldn't press on the brake, you allow your body to go back into the memory, and this time you do press on the brake. And the interesting thing is you update the memory. So what happened for me, the most impactful piece of treatment for me was my therapist asked me what was the worst moment. And the worst moment was that parking lot moment. And she said, what would have helped? Just ask your system what would have helped. And it immediately imagined my older brother, who I referenced, Patrick, showing up in his car with his wife. Patrick and I get in the car together. None of this happened. Patrick and I get in his car together. His wife drives the minivan of children where they need to go. And Patrick and I go see my mother together. And even though that is not what happened, a little bit it feels like that is what happened.
And somehow these therapy modalities helped you reimagine
they
something.
Settle your system. So if you think about a little kid who wakes up in the middle of the night because they're afraid of the dream that they had. And so you rub that child's back and you ask them, do you want to switch beds? Do you want to change your pajamas? Can I get you a glass of water? All of that is just shifting the energy that's inside their body. And so these are much more complicated, tried and true, done by brilliant practitioners. It's the same. And so we use breath work, we use music, sound, dance, equine therapy, just everything to take the tattoo of the terrible inside the body and mind and release it and put maybe, it's not dissociative. We're not trying to pretend that what happened didn't happen, but give more resources inside the body.
This is so interesting.
I agree. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And it's something that I don't think most people, society in general, knows about. And one of the things, you hear all the time, someone's struggling with this or this or that, or they have this or this or that, anxiety or whatever experience, and see a therapist, almost as if therapists are interchangeable.
Right.
There's some magic title called therapist that can address any or every.
We're not.
Yeah.
So what I often say to folks is like, I am writing this book right now and I'm talking about how like, listen, if you're grieving, you can go see a coach, you can see a pastor, you can talk to a best friend, except if you have trauma. Because trauma therapy, I mean, I spent $1 bazillion getting trained in all of these things because they're complicated, but mostly because the system is really delicate and it's very easy. I actually got trained because I had a rape victim in my office. And I said, well, tell me what happened. That's not what we do in trauma therapy. We don't take somebody back into a memory where they were totally dysregulated and had to disassociate with no tools. That's going to blow them outside of their window of tolerance, just like it did to begin with. And you can really destabilize a trauma survivor's life that way.
So
we therapist not narrative.
Yeah. So a therapist who isn't trained in those trauma nuances and
makes
therapies.
Mistakes.
Interesting.
Well, and treatment. So the stuff I'm talking about, EMDR is a treatment. So people, I always say, what are your impressions about about therapy? And people will often reference The Sopranos, which is so unfortunate. But I'm like, Tony Soprano goes in and just sort of like talks honestly. That's a form of therapy. That's great. But that is not treatment for symptoms. And so the kind of therapy that I do can't be replicated by reading a book because we have to take the energy. It's more like almost like physical therapy. Like the energy, we're stretching sort of the threshold of how you experience safety inside your own body. And we're trained in tools that people generally don't know about. So this is exactly my soapbox because, again, I'm on grief and loss boards. I support one, and people are writing all the time. When I go to bed at night, I see my daughter's dead body. And then I don't know what to do and I can't sleep all night. And this has been going on for 6 years. And the reason it's been going on for 6 years is they've never heard of the treatment. They don't realize there's treatment. And, and so they're out there kind of stuck, and you don't need to be stuck.
Well, okay. So let's say somebody's listening right now and they're having a similar experience.
Yep.
What's step one? Who do you call? Where do you go? What do you do? Like, how do you even begin to unpack, find help? And listeners can't see him doing air quotes, find help. Like what, how?
Well, I'm going to be honest and say that it's pretty tricky right now to find any practitioners to do anything because most of us have a really long waiting list. So having said that, knowing that is going to be really frustrating to people, EMDR, eye movement and desensitization reprocessing. There are a gajillion practitioners who are trained in that. That is where I start because I had a client who got all the resolution he needed in 90 minutes. I never saw him again. He came in, he had a different experience with witnessing his sister's death. He wrote about me in a book, but I never had to see him again. That was how comprehensive the help was. So I'm not trying to make that promise. Many people, it can take dozens and dozens of sessions, but it's a treatment. So that is one. Sensory motor psychotherapy, which is Pat Ogden's school. If you look up Pat Ogden, sensory motor psychotherapy, they have a list of all the people that are trained in sensory motor psychotherapy. You can go on to Psychology Today and put in your zip code and sensory motor psychotherapy. Somatic experiencing, which is Peter Levine, is very, very similar. It's Pat and Peter, used to be personally connected. His camp and her camp are very similar. Practitioners can tell you the difference between the two, but as a consumer, they're both really, really wonderful treatments.
Okay.
So those are the ones that I always ask people to start with. And, always ask the person that's working with you if they're trauma informed and ask them what that means. Because unfortunately, you wouldn't want someone treating someone with an eating disorder only because they themselves had an eating disorder, right? Like that's not treatment. That's just using your experience. And there isn't enough wisdom in that. And so there are a lot of people, particularly with grief, who are interested in grief, but aren't able to distinguish the difference between where the trauma comes in and needs treatment, specialized treatment. And, where we're just talking about coming underneath and supporting the experience of what it's like to be a griever.
Yeah. Okay. So this whole discussion is kind of blowing my mind.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. It blows my mind. I mean, it blows my mind all the time. And it really is my soapbox. If I get to tell people, hey, listen, there really is a thing that is, that makes trauma different. And what we need to be doing to look at trauma is different.
Right. Well, and one of the things that's blowing my mind here is the idea that trauma, how do I want to describe this? There isn't a universal yardstick. This is trauma. This is not trauma. This other thing is kind of trauma. Like this 100%. Whole idea. You articulated this idea that if it blows the individual's own window of tolerance.
Yeah. No one else was traumatized by my mother's death. Well, I don't know if that's true. I mean, my siblings would have to come on here. They were not traumatized as I was in that moment. And that right now, I think you would have a bunch of people that would tell you they were totally and completely traumatized by COVID, that COVID made their life less good for all the years that they have been living since COVID began, and that they have limiting beliefs and that they're more afraid and more scared and that their system is more anxious and more, and there are a whole bunch of people out there that are living their best life through COVID. So that's a good example of no, COVID is definitely a trauma. No question. We're all living through a trauma, but the folks who are writing about oh, we're all traumatized. Trauma and traumatized are not the same.
That's interesting.
There should be different words for it, because traumatized is the meaning made from the trauma.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting to think, I suppose there are some experiences that are more universally traumatizing than others, right? So if you take something like, I don't know, being caught in a house fire or something, I suppose a higher percentage of people would be traumatized by that than something else like maybe a divorce. Some people would be traumatized by that. Some people would not be traumatized by that.
Yes. So the intensity of what you experience certainly matters. The degree to which you feared for your life. So at waking up to a house on fire, your system is going to be flooded. But remember that where trauma usually happens is in freeze. So if you're able to get up, jump out the window, run away, you might not experience being traumatized. You may be less likely. You may have moved all the way through that unbelievable event so quickly that it didn't even make an imprint on your system. But if you're stuck in a room where the smoke and the fire is coming towards you and you can't get out and you can't move and you have no resistance, the energy is in your body, imprinting, tattooing in this experience of terror. But when you're able to resist it, you're literally not letting the energy land inside of you. So the experience of trauma is often when we end up in the freeze. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything.
That's interesting.
Stop this from happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, because it's one of the things I think it's tricky to think. Let's say you have a kid and their parent has died, or a kid or a teenager and their parent has died. And let's say there wasn't anything particularly dramatic, like they died in a house fire or they died in, let's say they had whatever. Let's just say they died.
Illness. Yeah.
An illness and they died. And so if for some kids that's traumatic and for some kids that's not traumatic, I guess.
Yep.
And I think you're saying that it depends on how the experience of that affects their ability to cope, or how it compares with.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have data on this, but I think I would tell you every child who loses a caretaker is traumatized. I'm not going to say traumatized, meaning that their life, they end up, I don't know, like a drug addict on the street. But what generally allows children not to be traumatized is having support around these feelings of fear and terror. So again, like it's going to be in their system. It's terrifying to lose a parent. And it's terrifying to have to organize the world maybe in a way that development, like for me, I just couldn't believe that other kids were walking around thinking adults could keep them safe. But at
after your friend died when you were young.
Yeah. I mean, I should have thought that adults could keep children safe because generally they do. Generally, they have much more of a capacity than not. So I do think it is traumatizing, meaning a child is overwhelmed. Their central nervous system is overwhelmed, but if they are well supported. So when they're upset, when they're feeling afraid, when they're feeling terrified, if they have trusted adults who can be with those feelings and sort of like almost like energetically hold it with them, then that's how we take that central nervous system down to calm, and we're back in the window of tolerance. Right. And so it doesn't mean that the traumatization, you can be traumatized and not have it be the thing that then is the truth for you for the rest of your life. My mother's death traumatized me, but I'm not traumatized now. I'm not traumatized about it now.
Because you got support and treatment.
Exactly. Because I got support and treatment, and because time and, all the things that sort of help your body come to terms with what has happened.
So this then makes me wonder, when you access this support and treatment as an adult, if you have a kid or a teenager that you think has been traumatized, like can kids and teenagers do EMDR or some of these other things?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. These treatments work 100%. So there's there are trauma-informed therapies that go across every developmental age. So you can, I was talking to a trauma therapist on my podcast who started working with Holocaust survivors. And, those people were at the end of their life, but she was still helping them regulate certain amounts of information that have been really hard on their body to think about, things that they couldn't talk about because it made them too upset. And then, they couldn't sleep for days. But yes, there are, when I trained in EMDR, I was training with a woman who primarily worked with adolescents and children, and kids love EMDR. I mean, it's like this weird, you generally use a wand or a light bar or a tapper, and you just go from left to right. And the person is supposed to follow your
with their eyes.
Yeah. But you don't really even need to talk. So it can be, brain spotting is a completely nonverbal version of it, a little less effective, and they use music, but kids can follow a bar with they don't mind doing that. And they're able to talk, a little bit through like what's happening, how do you feel, and get the primary treatment result, which is the memory that is really torturing them, or the part that is really difficult, will begin to sort of recede and be, I say, sort of like metabolized by the brain. The brain can just sort of handle it a little bit better.
So interesting. And so I'm thinking too, then, because sometimes I'll hear kids say, or parents will say, my teenager says therapy's dumb, therapy doesn't work. They, sitting there and talking to a therapist, they're not getting anything out of it. They don't feel like it's helping or whatever. And so then the kid doesn't want to go. And then they're kind of like, well, now what? And I guess it's either go to a therapist or no support. Like, it kind of seems like, how do you help your kid if they won't go to a therapist?
Well, so one of the things that's really tricky, I used to work in the emergency room at Children's Hospital. And one of the things that happened a lot with teenagers is like something bad would happen 6 hours ago, and their parents would bring them to the emergency room. And I totally understood why. And I'm a parent. I get it. But there isn't like an inoculation around how something is going to impact someone emotionally. And so particularly with childhood loss, I've worked with people who like their dad died when they were 7, but they didn't really feel the like acute pain until they were in their 20s. So I don't know that like I believe that there's a lot of wisdom in how people get treatment, including children. And so if children are unbelievably resistant to going to a therapist, I actually think there's wisdom in that. It's not time for them to go to therapy. And forcing them to go to therapy might actually harm their relationship with the idea that there's support to be got that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it again, a trusted adult who can hold space will ask about loss and be there whenever they're ready to experience whatever the pain is going to look like. But unless and I think when kids are doing stuff like running away from home and doing drugs and showing us that they're really struggling and they are not responsive to therapy, then it's time to sort of build a team so that we can look at what other possibilities. If you're rushing your kid to therapy just because something bad happened, that is not necessarily going to work.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yes. And it, again, it's blowing my mind because I think it's the, maybe you call it conventional wisdom or, layman's idea. There's this bad thing happened. My kid needs to go to therapy, or my kid's struggling. My kid needs to go to therapy, or, your kid's struggling and another parent says, why don't you send him to therapy? And then you're like, well, I tried, but they refused. And then you feel like a bad parent because you can't get your kid to go to therapy. Right. It becomes this like thing. So this is so, gosh, we could keep talking about this all day long, and maybe we'll have
to all day long.
But I do think we're running out of time. I don't want to let you go without asking about your book that's coming out, I think next year from Zibby Books. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I started writing. I mean, interestingly, right. I'm a trauma therapist. I do a lot of talk therapy. I didn't want to talk anymore about, when I came out of treatment, I just didn't want to talk about it anymore. It wasn't, I didn't really know how to explain myself to other people. And I felt really precious about my treatment. And I didn't want to talk about my treatment to other people. And I started keeping a journal and doing some blog posting about my mom. And what actually happened was I wrote the story of taking my mother to the hospital. I wrote it on a blog post because I sort of relived it on Christmas Eve. My mom was this tiny little lady and I took her to the hospital, and I used to work in a hospital, so I knew it was going to be like a refrigerator car. So I brought a sweater and I brought socks. And when she wasn't wet, when she was feeling a lot of pain, she didn't want the sweater or the socks. When she started to feel better because they gave her an IV, she was like, oh, I'm freezing. Give me the sweater and the socks. So I gave her the sweater, but I couldn't find the socks. So I took them off my own feet. These little Under Armour socks that had different colors and the little swooshy things like feet. And my mom, who was very funny, sort of sat there like with a sweater for a minute. And she's like, can I ask you a question? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, did you take these socks off your own feet? And I was like, yes. And then she was quiet. And then she was like, can I ask you another question? And I was like, yeah. She's like, why don't young people care if their socks match? And I was like, woman, just shut up and say thank you. Like, just shut up. So I it's almost sort of biblical, but I can get really choked up at the idea that like I concretely in some of the last days of her life gave my mother, the socks off my own feet. And it was Christmas Eve, the year that she had died. So it was 6 months after she died. And I was in the bathroom at my in-laws' house and looked down and I had 2 different colored athletic socks on. And it was just unbearable to me. And I felt so alone. And I wrote just that little story that I told you and put it out into the ether of the internet, which is not something I typically did. And I just had an outpouring, mostly from people I knew, people I hadn't spoken to from high school in years, of their own stories. And it was so validating in a way that like, it was hard to explain. It wasn't something my husband could give me or my siblings could give me. So I started writing. That got me connected to Zibby Owens, who's my publisher. She offered me the opportunity to be in a writing fellowship where I sort of morphed those blog posts into a draft. And now that draft is being worked on by another amazing editor, and it's going to be published when it's published. It's, they have sort of a system over there. So I'm not totally clear. It might be 2024, but that book is called End of the Hour. And it is the story of my father's death and my mother's death and me going to treatment and coming back out of treatment, sort of, really profoundly changed.
Wow.
So it's important and it's beautiful and it's been a gift to get to work on.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. I am going to look out for that.
Thank you.
And maybe when it comes out, we'll have to have you back on the show. And
I would love that.
Dive a little deeper on some of that.
Yeah.
And good. Okay. Gosh. Well, you know what? I think that's just a great place to end today.
Sounds great.
I
Thank
think
you so
we've
much for having me.
Yeah. Well, and we've had such a great discussion. This is probably the third time I've saying it, but kind of mind blown. So I'm going to have to go and re-listen to this, make some good notes, get all the resources noted for people. And I'm sure this is the first of many discussions we will have over time on this and other things. And I will remind people again to listen to back to back, maybe if you have time, this discussion and then my discussion, your discussion on your show with me. Could be kind of an interesting pairing. So good. Great. Okay. Well, my guest today is Meghan Riordan Jarvis, psychotherapist specializing in trauma and grief and loss. So Meghan, where can listeners find your podcast and everything else about your work?
Yeah. So if you Google Grief is My Side Hustle, which is easier than trying to figure out how to spell Riordan, but it is Meghan has an H, Meghan, Riordan is Riordan, like Rick Riordan, the adolescent author, and Jarvis. Either one of those will take you to my website. You can sign up for my newsletter there. You can find all my podcasts there. And you're really welcome to DM me and ask questions. People write to me every single day asking me to help partner them with trauma therapy. And anytime I can, I will. And anytime I can't, I'll point you in the direction of, a better place to start. It's really hard to find. I really don't mind being asked. So yeah, I'll try to help.
Awesome. Well, Meghan, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much. Take good care.
You too. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Meghan Riordan Jarvis as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 122. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.